Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Monday, July 29th, 2013, starting a brand new week, almost out of July, getting into August, getting through the summer here. A lot of stuff going on today we have to talk about. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in tomorrow during our third hour. Kevin Annett will be our guest to talk about this exploding scandal up in Canada. Perhaps I shouldn't use that word exploding. This has been building for years and years and years, and it relates to these horrible abuses inside the Canadian government's residential schools for Indigenous children. And Canada funded them, but they were being run by the Catholic Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada. And this scandal goes way beyond the pedophilia that we have seen infecting religions all around the globe. Physical abuse on the scale of outright torture. Yes, lots of sexual abuse and outright deaths. They've uncovered mass graves. It's just an eye-opener. The church has been fighting the exposure of this. The Canadian government's been fighting the exposure of this. Recently, Canadian courts ordered the government to turn over all the records of what happened in these schools. It's a terrible, terrible scandal. We'll be talking with Kevin about that. Still working on nailing down exactly when Ben Swan will be our guest to talk about his new venture. To basically transition into the independent media and keep on doing those wonderful reports that he was doing when he was with Fox 19 in Cincinnati here. Big story locally, of course, is Tropical Storm Flossie, although we were starting to call it Tropical Storm Floppy because it's slowing down, it's stalling, it's losing strength rapidly. The highest sustained winds are now down to 45 miles per hour. They were up to 60 over the weekend. That's the good news. The bad news is the most recent storm track that they're putting out there, the storm track has shifted northward, and the center of the storm is now expected to come over Honolulu sometime late tomorrow. So given the rather fragile nature of infrastructure in this country, there is a possibility we could lose our electricity and our internet connection. So if there is an outage to the What Really Happened website, or at least the updates stop working because the servers aren't here in Hawaii, or if we have problems on the radio show on Wednesday, you'll understand why. It's just the storm is coming on over. So we're battening down and getting out the plastics and all the rest of that stuff, and we'll see what happens there. Apparently over in the Atlantic, Dorian is re-energizing as it approaches the Bahamas. They're now expecting that to be a Cat 1 hurricane by the time it gets to Miami. And we have another tropical depression forming in the Pacific off the coast of Mexico that could likewise follow Flossie here into the Hawaiian Islands. So it's a very dynamic hurricane season that we're getting into. Now, I was noticing earlier today how the corporate media is all of a sudden focusing on Benghazi and the possibility that Congress is going to form a special committee to investigate Benghazi, meaning to basically corral all the cover-ups into one place for the sake of convenience. Like the Warren Commission was created to head off the investigations in Dallas and Texas, where jurisdiction rightfully belonged. Oh, no. We'll investigate here at the top of the government and tell you what to believe, which is a very common practice that we've seen, where the government will have an investigation in order to block and prevent any other investigations. But what's really interesting is, you've probably noticed over the last week, the corporate media has sort of gone away from IRS Gate. They've gone away from DOJ Gate. They've gone away from, certainly from NSA Gate. Oh, no big deal. We've got a royal baby to wave at you. But they're still talking about Benghazi. And the reason for that is, we've seen this pattern before. Remember, I talked about how there are two kinds of secrets in Washington, D.C. There are the little secrets that can be used as political weapons, like Anthony Weiner's sexting messages, that can be used to destroy him, but are not damaging to the government as a whole. Then there are the great secrets that nobody wants to talk about because they delegitimize the entire government, like the Kennedy assassination, like faking 9/11. Nobody will ever talk about those. Now, the IRS targeting of political dissidents, the NSA mass spying on law-abiding American citizens have called into question the legitimacy of the current federal government. It is clearly operating outside the Constitution of the United States of America. But the media doesn't want to spend a lot of time on that because that ends the party for everybody. And so it looks like they're going to put the focus back on Benghazi. We're basically in an era of pin the Benghazi on the Obama, because that can just be dumped. Oh, it's Obama and his people. It wasn't the government as a whole, which is nonsense, because if indeed, as I suspect, Benghazi was a political stunt to aid Obama in his campaign against Romney and it went out of control, large segments of the U.S. government did have to be involved in that. We know about the stand-down orders to the SEALs. We know about the stand-down orders to the CIA agents at the Annex. But this one can be spun, oh, it was just Obama and his committee to re-elect the president. It really is shaping up to be a replay of what we saw against Nixon. And again, we've seen this pattern before, because the real scandal behind Nixon's plumbers unit burglarizing the Watergate was to get back those pictures the Democrats had of the 3 tramps arrested in Dealey Plaza following the Kennedy assassination, who were identifiable as people working for Richard Nixon. And that was a story nobody wanted to come out. So it was obstruction of justice and misuse of the IRS, and Nixon was forced to resign. We saw it again during the Whitewater hearings, where the real scandal was government-sanctioned drug smuggling during Iran-Contra. And Ken Starr's job was to take everybody's attention off of a scandal like that, where the biggest drug smuggler in the country is the country, because that would have delegitimized the entire government in the view of the American people. And the focus was put on Bill Clinton getting a Hummer from Monica Lewinsky and stains on blue dresses, distracting you all with a tawdry little spy scandal. And it looks like they're getting ready to do the same thing. They're going to use Benghazi and try and put the focus on there to make it look like Congress is doing its job of oversight, but to take focus away from these larger scandals that do actually undermine the legitimacy of the United States government. Now, we're continuing to see anger and momentum build against the NSA. Obama's out there saying, oh, it's just a phony scandal. No, it isn't. You, Barack Obama, are the phony. You are a phony figurehead for a phony government that sees power in phony elections to plunder the American people for the benefit of Wall Street financial corporations, to pay for all these pointless wars of conquest, to tithe Israel. You, Obama, are the phony, not the American people and not these scandals. These crimes really were done. There's nothing phony about them. It's the federal government that is phony. They are not abiding by the Constitution, and that makes them illegitimate. They're fakers, phonies. Meanwhile, we're seeing more stories coming out over the weekend about how the NSA is just grabbing everything out there, and again raising the question, are they really just saving the metadata from phone calls? And as we already pointed out, the sheer size of that Utah storage facility is many, many, many times larger than it needs to be to save the metadata from every phone call made on planet Earth for the last 7 years. It is large enough to save the content of every phone call made on planet Earth for the last 7 years. Even for government waste, they're not going to go to this. So on the basis of the scale of the data storage facility itself, yes, they have been recording the content of all your phone calls. Remember, we had that other whistleblower came forward on ABC and said NSA listens to the phone calls of our serving military in the war zones, calling back home, and the really sexy, juicy talk gets passed around like free porn. So yes, they're listening to the phone calls. There's no question here. Now, Dianne Feinstein is out there trying to demonize Edward Snowden, saying he took more data that's dangerous to the country, very sensitive data. They're trying to villainize him, and it's not working. The vast majority of the American people, the vast majority of the people of the world see Edward Snowden as a hero. They want him honored. It's the U.S. government that is viewed as the criminal threat to us all. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right America, back. Welcome back to the show. And I just got a request from our control room to mention that it is in the third hour of tomorrow's show that Kevin Annett will be our on-air guest to talk about the Canadian residential schools scandal. It's an ugly, ugly piece of history. And when you hear the details, you will understand just why the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church and the Canadian government wanted to hush this up. It's an ugly story. And it's a reminder that all of these institutions, government and religion, are not what you are taught they are. Now, the U.S. government is apparently still continuing this policy of trying to fan up racial strife in the American people, blacks against whites, or whites against Hispanic, or Hispanic against Irish. I don't really know, but they're trying to factionalize the American people because they're afraid we're waking up and realizing we're one American people. And the problems in our lives all go back to that private central banking, the government itself, and they're trying to figure out some way to split us. And I saw this interesting video. Anti-white racism has reached critical mass in America. So now they're trying to convince the white people that they are victims of racial discrimination, which is not without merit. I'm sure a lot of us at one time in our lives have felt the pressure of losing a job because of quota-based hiring, for affirmative action. And yes, it's out there. But they're not looking at correcting those abuses. They're just trying to fan the flames of race hate to try and distract the American people from what's been going on inside Washington, D.C., inside Wall Street. They're looking to distract us all from Floodgate. They're going to offer up Obama in Benghazi as a sacrificial lamb in order to preserve the legitimacy of an illegitimate government. And they are illegitimate at this point. You cannot make the case that this government has any legal right to continue in power and authority when they are violating the rules of that Constitution. Another story they came out with about how archaeologists found the remains of an early African-American community here in the United States. Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. So they're just trying to put out any stories that say black here or white here or Hispanic here. They're trying to split the American people into groups and get them fighting with each other. It's an old tactic. They did it back in the 60s here. Now, turning over to the war zones, and I emphasize the plural, apparently Syrian government forces have now recaptured Homs, which basically looks like it will cement the retaking of Aleppo, and it looks like Assad is on the verge of just absolutely ending this 3-year attempt at a covert coup d'etat. They killed a lot of these hired mercenaries in the retaking of Homs. Over the weekend, of course, there was another bombing in Damascus. And again, there's a very interesting story. This came out of NBC. Who's backing who as Syria's civil war threatens to spread? They're still pushing the idea this is a civil war, this is a revolution, it's not our fault. And there was this wonderful quote in this NBC story, it has already affected neighboring countries and now threatens to drag in the United States. Threatens to drag in the United States? Are you guys at NBC on SSRIs? The United States wanted this war with Syria. They wanted a covert overthrow, a regime change to force Syria to sell their oil only for U.S. dollars, to force Syria to accept a private central bank issuing the public currencies a loan at interest. They wanted Syria smashed to please Israel. And mostly they wanted Syria because it's the final stepping stone to the long lusted for war with Iran. The U.S. created this covert attempted overthrow, masquerading as a popular revolt. They sent in money and weapons in a blatant attempt at coup d'etat. Remember over the weekend the story came out that the U.S. had paid those members of the Syrian police department who had quit their jobs and joined the rebels. They were being paid by the United States. And after almost 3 years, this coup attempt has failed, much as the attempted coup d'etat in Iran in 2009 failed. And that's why the U.S. is regretfully planning a direct invasion. There's nothing about dragging in the United States. The United States is looking for an excuse to go in there, to throw your sons and daughters at another Middle Eastern oil country that dares to sell their oil for currencies other than the dollar. Apparently, Israel has staged another bombing attack on Syria, claiming that they blew up warheads for long-range missiles. We don't know what they blew up, but they blew up something. These are acts of war committed by Israel against Syria. And Syria continues to say, one more provocation from Syria and we will be forced to go to war. Well, the war is already going on, and as usual, Israel's trying to make it look like it's the other guy's fault. Syria made us attack them. Really, we didn't want to do it. Syria made us do it. Really. Now, last week, we were talking about this proclamation that was coming out of Israel that the ruins of King David's temple had been found. Huzzah, huzzah, see, it proves the Old Testament. We were here first, everybody else has to get out. And I commented at that time that all they found were some stone ruins, and there wasn't anything in the find that actually identified it as having anything to do with King David. And now, one of Israel's own leading archaeologists and a professor at Tel Aviv University, Israel Finkelstein, has come forward to say the artifacts actually found at that site are those of an Arab civilization. And there is absolutely nothing in this find that links it to King David or even to the ancient Israelites. And we know that Israel has a long history of attempting to co-opt archaeological finds to justify its ownership of that land. Remember those frauds that came out? They found the carved ivory pomegranate temple staff that was supposed to be from the first temple. That was exposed as a fraud. Then there was the Jehoash tablet that purportedly documented repair work that was done to the temple. That was a fake. The reality is, if you travel all over the Middle East, you go down to Egypt, you go to any of these countries, you can't take 3 steps without tripping over the remains of their ancient history. But when it comes to Israel and the claimed kingdoms of David and Solomon, there is zero archaeological evidence to support it. It just isn't there. And these archaeological treasures in these other countries are a major political embarrassment to Israel, which justifies its dispossession of the Palestinians from that land by saying, oh, we had these ancient kingdoms of David and Solomon and all the rest of them. That was all here first, and the first temple was here. And there is no trace of any of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why every time the United States invades a country that Israel doesn't like, they set out to destroy its archaeological heritage. The United States built an Air Force base over the remains of the city of Ur in Iraq. Just bulldozed it flat, put pavement over it to make a runway. They want to erase these other archaeological wonders, to put Israel on a level playing field, to say, well, see, all these things go away, but just take our word for it. And now we have one of Israel's own leading archaeologists saying, no, that's not what they found. It made for good press, and the politicians loved it. It's not real. I think one of the reasons that famed Egyptologist Zahi Hawass fell from media grace was his coming out and showing the archaeological evidence that the Exodus did not actually happen to the Hebrews. It happened to a different people, the Hyksos. And the ancient Hebrews simply copied the story and said, oh, this is our suffering. Now, again, back then, there was no such thing as intellectual property rights. The physical book or scroll was the item of value because of the labor involved in creating it. And they were not shy about copying other stories. I mean, the story of Noah and the Ark was actually from the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And as I was mentioning just before we got cut off by the outro music before, if you go back and look at a lot of ancient religious texts, they were not shy about copying stories from other places. The story of Noah and the flood appears in a great many ancient texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predate the writing of the Old Testament by quite a long time. And they took the story and they recast the deity to the god they were putting into the sales brochure. And, of course, it's known that copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh were in Pharaoh's library during the time that Moses, who may have been actually Akhenaten, the monotheistic pharaoh, the one monotheistic pharaoh they had, was there, could have read it all. So there was no concept of plagiarism back then because the book or the scroll was the item of value. And people just copied ideas left and right. And so just because it's in this particular book doesn't mean it actually happened to this particular people. It's just stories and metaphors and entertainment. Now, getting over to Tunisia, as you know, they've had a couple of very visible assassination of opposition leaders. One of them about 6 months ago, another one last week, and it's provoked massive protests. And observers are now saying the Islamic government of Tunisia may not survive the crisis. There are major protests over there, and apparently the Tunisian army has now declared the protest areas closed military zones. They basically have taken that main square in the capital, Tunis, and they've simply barbed wired it off and said nobody can come in here. It's a closed military zone. That is a public square where the public is supposed to meet, and now the military is saying, closed military zone, we're holding war games or something there. So it's getting very, very tense over there. Over in Egypt, of course, people are back in the streets of Cairo in this ongoing confrontation between Morsi's supporters and those who saw him as pandering way too much to the United States and Israel and want him out. The Egyptian military are now in control. The U.S. government's position is they wanted Morsi out and a new Mubarak in, and the military is not leaning in that direction. They're already talking about normalizing diplomatic relations with Syria, and as a result, the U.S. is now cutting off financial aid to Egypt, and they've canceled delivery of the F-16s that were going to be delivered to Israel, ostensibly so to Egypt rather. The Pentagon has canceled delivery of the F-16s that were scheduled to go to Egypt, ostensibly so Egypt could use them to help bomb Syria. So that's all falling apart. Another major foreign policy blunder. All the people of the world are breaking free of this global political war machine. It's about time, too. Now, over in the Sinai, there's been a scream that, there are jihadists, and they're shooting at Sinai security headquarters. The problem is the missile that was used is made in the United States. So given Israel's stated goal of deliberately creating instability in the Sinai as a precursor to taking it back, to reoccupying it, the question is, where did these so-called jihadists, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say no more, get this U.S.-made rocket? It's another false flag. All war is based in deception. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Been a lot of talk about an announcement that came out a couple of weeks back about how now the Pentagon is actively planning and making preparations for an eventual war with China. And the funny thing is, nobody can actually identify who said, yeah, we're going to war with China. We're in this absurd situation right now where the Pentagon is saying, we, the American people, who pay the taxes to buy the bullets, who breed the soldiers who will bleed the fields red in all of these wars of conquest, we're no longer allowed to know where the U.S. is at war. The list of war theaters currently being fought by the United States government is now at least partly classified. You're not supposed to know where your kids are going or where we're invading. Now, we know why the United States wants to go to war against China. China is promoting the yuan as a replacement for the dollar as the global trade and reserve currency. China has already signed agreements with 8 different nations for direct currency exchanges without going through the dollar. It's a major threat to the supremacy of the dollar. And that's why China is now on the special high interest targets list. Same thing with Russia, which took control of their central bank in order to turn the public currency back to a public utility. That's what put Russia on the United States government's special high interest targets list. And the fear coming out of the U.S. government that all of this is now known to the American people, who are supposed to just shut up, sit down, pay the cost of the war, and breed as many new soldiers as they can, is becoming more and more evident with all this renewed talk about we have to take control of the internet for the children. Apparently Google has now disabled the Press TV YouTube account. They don't want you seeing the other side of any of these stories any longer. You will accept your U.S. government propaganda, and you will like it. You won't dare see these invaded nations as just ordinary people trying to live their lives. You have to see them as all potential terrorists and evil Muslims who hate us for our freedoms. A lot of continuing concern over Great Britain's new internet censorship program, ostensibly to block child porn. They always find something the public will agree with and use that to sell something that is not in the public interest. And it's already coming out in more and more articles. Wired was talking about this. Activist Post was talking about this. By default, the new proposed British web censorship system will block conspiracy websites. They'll block websites that are considered esoteric, which is one of those gray words that can mean anything. The idea being that if a certain website only has a limited audience or a limited context, that it will be blocked so that, yeah, the people who know about it can go there, but people searching the web won't be able to find it. And the model that they have over there is that pretty much everybody outside the corporate media websites are going to be in the filter, and individual webmasters, such as moi, will have to apply and go through a paperwork process to be cleared for the filter. In other words, the British government now wants to license webmasters so that only websites approved by the government are visible to the web. That's what they're really talking about here. Over the weekend, a new video surfaced of the final moments of Michael Hastings. Security camera footage, black and white, showing the car racing down the road at a high rate of speed, and clearly shows the car exploding before it impacted the tree. No indications of any braking. I know a lot of people are talking about apparently how easy it is to remotely hack modern computerized cars and take over control of the driver controls, floor the gas, disable the brakes, even influence the steering. But this video clearly shows the car exploding before it hits the tree. And that explains why in the photos that we were shown of the car, there was a tarp thrown over the engine compartment. Normally, when there is a fatal car crash, in order to protect public sensibilities, they'll throw a tarp over the windows of the passenger compartment so you don't see this horribly mangled body inside. But in this case, go back and do a web search and find them yourself. The windows into the passenger compartment were wide open, and the tarp was thrown over the engine compartment. Why would they do that unless there was something about that engine compartment that should not be made public? And with the surfacing of this latest security video, there is now no longer any question that Michael Hastings was assassinated. The car exploded before it hit the tree. We're in an age of wet work. The government is simply presuming to itself the authority to assassinate Americans who just refuse to believe the government story on anything. Obviously, Mr. Hastings was in possession of some information that was critically damaging to the United States government. And it's just a reality of the time that we live in. And for those who are going to get out there and speak the truth about what's going on, it's just something, it's a risk you have to accept. Now, story that came out over 12160, and I'm rather ashamed that this came out of Concord, New Hampshire, because I consider myself a New Hampshire kid. I was actually born in Boston, but I spent my childhood on a farm in New Hampshire. The motto of the state, live free or die, and why that is a joke. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show, and we're talking about a story that's coming out of Concord, New Hampshire. And you need to remember the motto of the state of New Hampshire is live free or die. They were the first state to sign the Declaration of Independence. They have a long history or tradition of being at the forefront of personal liberty. And yet, the Concord, New Hampshire Police Department has applied to the Department of Homeland Security for a grant in order to buy militarized vehicles with which to suppress peaceful political demonstrations. Under the guise that peaceful political protests represent a form of domestic terrorism. And the threat is real, and the threat is here. The people are starting to stand up and complain about the government. That cannot be allowed. And being that my roots are in New Hampshire, I'm thoroughly ashamed of the Granite State for taking this attitude that peaceful political protest represents a form of domestic terrorism. Coming out of the economic news, you probably saw this on the corporate media. 80%, according to the latest survey, 80% of U.S. adults, 4 out of every 5, are living in near poverty, at risk of imminent unemployment, struggling with joblessness, having to rely on some form of welfare or food stamps. Sure sign of the deteriorating economic situation out here in the private sector. People in the government, they're doing great. They're making money hand over fist. I used to say that people in government are making about 30% more for the exact same job in the private sector. There was another study that came out over the weekend saying it's actually close to double now. That if you're doing job X for the government, you're being paid almost double what somebody doing the exact same job in the private sector is being paid. That's why people in government are so loyal to the government. They're living high on the hog. It's your hog, but they're living high on the hog here. So apparently Associated Press ran this survey showing that 80% of Americans are in serious, serious trouble, hanging by a thread. Now, the corporate TV news media was reframing it to say dealing with fiscal uncertainty, which is a very polite euphemism to sort of blunt the impact of the numbers. 80% of Americans. So all this nonsense about, oh, the unemployment rate is only 7%, the economy's doing great, light at the end of the tunnel, green shoots, so forth and so on. The reality is 80% of Americans are in trouble and just barely hanging on. And what's the government's solution for that? Oh, we got to raise taxes, got to fight carbon dioxide, got to fight global warming, got to save the banks because banks are more important than people in the United States. Story coming out of Investment Watch blog that as Detroit heads into something that certainly looks like bankruptcy, but they're trying to avoid calling it that in order to not trigger all the credit default swaps against Detroit's debt. The hue and cry from the bankers is privatization. We're going to sell off all of Detroit to private owners to pay off the banker loans. It reminds me of the movie RoboCop 2. Where they're in the middle and literally the main arch villain, the head of this giant corporation played by Dan Hurley, I forget what the character's name was, says, we're taking Detroit private. And that's the model, to take all of these public utilities that were paid for by the taxpayer, sell them off to private interests who will then rent them back to the taxpayers whose tax money built them in the first place. We've seen this all across the country. Highways built with your tax dollars are then sold off to private interests who turn them into toll roads. They're turning the United States of America into a single giant money-making operation. And where it is failing is that nobody is thinking about how Americans are going to come up with the money to pay the new tolls or the new fees or the inflated prices for water and electricity and sewage and garbage collection. Because those prices always go up when these utilities are privatized. Because they're no longer public utilities, they are money-making ventures. The cash grab is on. They're trying to take as much money from you as they possibly can. And nobody is worried about how Americans are going to earn that money to pay all these increased costs. They're willing to loan you more money at interest. But nobody's worried about how Americans are going to work to pay this off. This entire debt-based economy is operating on the blind faith that somehow or other Americans will magically come up with this money. We're not allowed to print it up out of thin air the way the Federal Reserve is. But somehow we will just figure out for ourselves how to get money flowing back into this country to pay these increased fees and taxes. That's bad planning. Because when you're planning an economy, it doesn't stop with how do we get more money out of the American people. It has to begin with how do we get money into the hands of the American people in order to take it back out for these increased profit-making ventures. And nobody's thinking about that. That should have been the government, the job of the federal government, and they've dropped the ball on that one. We're going to take a phone call here. Jim in Georgia. Aloha, Jim. Thank you for waiting. What's on your mind?
Hello, Michael. If you would have patience with me, I've been retired for 5 years. I work for the grocery store as a butcher, and I have choices. I have a price list in front of me. that what the difference is then till now, and then what the difference is pay and man-hour production, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll do this as quick as I possibly can, okay? Coffee was 33 ounces. It was $4.49 a pound. Now it's $8, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Milk was $1.39. Now it's $3.49. Cooking oil was $1.59. Now it's $3.89. Ground beef, $1.59. Now it's $4.49. Bread, $1.29. Now it's $2.79. Bacon. I can go on and on and on.
Oh yeah, we're seeing that every day.
Michael, here what I want to show you is the job at that time paid $12.50 an hour, and we were covered as far as insurance, holidays, and vacation. Now our insurance cost us $6,000 a year, where before it was $3,200. Let me look at this. Please bear with me, okay? They cut our vacations, they cut our holidays, and our man-hour production went from 150 man-hour sales, from $156 in man-hour sales to now, when I was talking to someone, it's $474 man-hour sales. So where they had people at that time, 8 people cutting the same amount of product, now they have 5.5 people because they have more part-timers. So people, I feel sorry for the young people in this country. And what's happening now is I know McDonald's people are trying to start a union and want $15 an hour, which is outrageous at McDonald's. But I can understand why, because this country has turned into a service country, okay? Where
Yes.
There's no more plants. There's no more making cars. There's no more making buses and stuff like that. All we're doing is making hamburgers and serving people. And it can't keep up, Michael.
No, it can't.
Things have to happen. Things have to happen. It really does. And I feel sorry for the younger generation. I know property tax has doubled. Car insurance has doubled. So people, and when I listened to your program from 12 to 2 o'clock, it was about 50 years ago about Hitler. What we need to do is talk about today, not 50 years ago.
I agree.
Thank you, Michael.
I absolutely agree. All the way back in the 1980s, it was very obvious that the United States was starting to lose its manufacturing. And rather than correct that situation, rather than incentivize more research, more development, more technology incubators, rather than try and rebuild manufacturing, Washington, D.C. basically adopted the attitude of Wall Street. We don't need to get our hands greasy. We'll just make this stuff overseas at lower cost and our profits will be up. And in order to deal with the loss of jobs back in the 1980s, that's when they came up with the idea of the service economy. We don't need to make products. We'll run the nation on the service economy, which was this idea that we would do each other's laundry for a fee, and this would make everything work. And when we come back from news and station identification, I'll explain why that did not work. Aloha, welcome back to the show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And following up with our conversation with Jim in Georgia, all the way back in the 1980s, it was apparent that America was starting to lose a lot of its manufacturing, especially in the high-tech areas. And because members of Congress, even back then, were pretty much useless in the real world and didn't understand manufacturing, they, like upper corporate management, said, we don't need to know about it. It's not important. We'll just do it overseas. And the jobs in manufacturing began to leave the United States of America, along with those Americans who actually knew how to set up and organize manufacturing facilities. Other nations saw a wonderful opportunity to plunder America's manufacturing brain trust and lured these people away with good salaries, good living conditions, a chance to see the rest of the world. And they literally stripped away the best manufacturing brains of this nation back then. And the U.S. government, which didn't want to deal with the problem, didn't even want to admit there was a problem, said, we will transition the United States to the service economy, in which we'll all do each other's laundry for a fee. And that was the big push. Everything was a service. We're going to have a service and, entrepreneurship and so forth. And the problem was that because there were no real products that were being manufactured for export, America's trade imbalance began to grow. And the only thing the service economy did in creating new jobs out of the services we used to do for ourselves was increase the opportunity for taxation by the government. So the government loved the service economy because they were accruing new tax revenues coming on in, but the reality is the long decline of standard of living for regular American people began in the 1980s, and it has continued to decline without respite ever since. You cannot run a nation doing each other's laundry for a fee. At some point, you must have a product to sell. And because the United States allowed our best manufacturing minds to be lured to other countries, we're no longer able to make products that compete with the rest of the world. Plus, we have this disaster with GMO where the rest of the world does not want to buy our agricultural produce. They don't want to buy our pharmaceuticals. Even America's much vaunted weapons, the most expensive weapons in the world, aren't doing very well, as illustrated by the F-22s continuing to asphyxiate its pilots, and the F-35, which is turning out to be such a boondoggle that the Pentagon is having to rewrite the original requirements downward so they can accept the thing and say it's over and done with, let's move on to the next project. Now, up in Detroit, we've been talking about Detroit and its sort of bankruptcy mania, not a real bankruptcy, but an incredible simulation. Apparently, there's a big scandal up there where Detroit police officers have been arrested for pulling drivers over and then robbing them at gunpoint. So much for to protect and to serve. Let me back up and give that to you one more time. Up in Detroit, the Detroit police officers, the actual law enforcement officers, some of them have been arrested for pulling drivers over for a traffic stop and then robbing them at gunpoint. Coming soon to a city near you. Speaking of which, apparently over in Chicago, they're not doing much better over there. Their cash balance has plummeted to just $33 million, which for a city the size of Chicago, that's not an awful lot. And their debt load has now tripled. Now, you're probably seeing a brouhaha on the corporate media about how Congress must raise the U.S. government's debt ceiling again to reassure everybody that the U.S. government can pay its bills. Well, first of all, we already know that over at the U.S. Treasury's own website, the number revealing government debt has been hovering just below that last debt ceiling for almost 2 months now. They're fibbing. They've already gone through the debt ceiling. They don't want anybody to know it. But we busted them on it because that number went right up to the debt ceiling and just froze, and it stayed there. And the reality is, increasing the U.S. government's debt ceiling is not going to reassure anybody that the government can pay its bills, because obviously this government cannot balance its books to spend only what it's taking in. It has to go on borrowing. That's what they want, is another credit card. The federal government is running itself like somebody who gets a credit card and maxes it out, and they apply for a new credit card and they max that out. They apply for a new credit card and they max that out, and they keep on going until finally somebody says there are no more credit cards. That's how they've been operating. Because it's always, the bill is going to be, the American people are going to get stuck with the bill. We don't have to pay it ourselves. We've been talking about how the Federal Reserve is planning on continuing its policy of quantitative easing. This is the little euphemism they have for creating $85 billion a month out of thin air to shower all over Wall Street to keep their balance sheets in the black. That's the only thing propping Wall Street up. They take that money, they put it on their balance sheet, they buy more blocks of stock to keep the stock market up, because they're so heavily invested in the stock market. If there's a major correction, they're going to be insolvent overnight. Now, the reason we have not seen as much inflationary pressure from this $85 billion a month is that most of these Wall Street firms are just keeping the majority of that cash on their books as excess reserves. And what they're doing, what I think they're doing, is they're trying to build up excess cash reserves out of this instantly created money in order to deal with the coming firestorm of credit default swaps, whether it's triggered by Detroit or by someplace over in Europe. They're just printing up the money to have it on hand to pay off those credit default swaps. It's going to take a long time to reach how much they need because the total estimated exposure against Europe's debt by Wall Street is now somewhere around $90 trillion. Now, the problem is when those credit default swaps do come due and Wall Street starts dumping all of these reserves onto the economy to pay off those credit default swaps, all of the inflationary pressure that has been avoided up to now is going to hit all at once. Literally overnight, we will be back in Weimar Republic territory where it's going to take an entire basket full of these worthless paper notes to buy a loaf of bread. And all of this is happening because the United States federal government thinks that banks are more important than the American people. That has got to stop. We're going to take a phone call here. Tom in Florida. Aloha, Tom. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, thank you very much for having me on. I caught part of your show. I've been going in and out here, but I heard you talking about the United States being a service economy.
Yes.
And this is how we seem to be stuck. And what I say is, what would happen if the United States was to start to selectively raise tariffs on sort of sectors of manufactured goods? In other words, to keep it stable so it didn't go wild all at once. Let's say rubber products, and they start to ratchet up the tariff on rubber products coming into the country, which would stimulate people inside the country to start manufacturing themselves.
I don't know that rubber would do it because rubber basically doesn't grow very well in the United States of America. But it would certainly encourage American manufacturing to have tariffs on imported cars, imported electronics. But every time you start to do that, these large multinational corporations that are making huge amounts of money by manufacturing in foreign countries and then selling to Americans on credit, they scream, oh, protectionism, protectionism. We're working toward a global economy. Well, the global economy they've got so far isn't working very well for anybody but those owners of the corporations. But again, our government is just totally aligned with these financial corporations, and that, of course, according to Benito Mussolini, is the definition of fascism. And so we're just going to have to wait patiently for this system to implode, learn from the mistakes and abuses of the last system, and just start a whole new country from the ground up, the blueprint for the new America. And we have to be working on that right now because it's not going to hold together much longer. All right, maybe that was too selective. I'm just saying that there's so much stuff made overseas. If you go to say a big store and you see no, I agree. I agree, and we do need to take steps to encourage American manufacturing. Got to take a break. Be right back. America, welcome back to the show. And getting back to the economy here, we understand that back in 2008. When this whole mortgage-backed security fraud was being ginned up, and it was such a huge success, they were desperate to sell mortgages even to people who really did not meet the underwriting standards, the so-called subprimes, and they were luring people into the housing market with adjustable rate mortgages where you'd go in there and your mortgage percentage was very low, and then supposedly as you found a better paying job, your mortgage rate would go up. Well, the better paying jobs were never there. Just ask any recent college graduate struggling with their student loans. And by the way, the interest on those is going up. And you would think that Wall Street would learn from past mistakes, but they don't have a reason to, because none of the major players in the mortgage-backed security fraud were ever investigated, ever arrested, ever charged, ever sent to jail. The U.S. federal government adopted as a policy in 2008 that nobody behind the mortgage bundling was going to be investigated because they had to preserve the reputation for trustworthiness and honesty of the American banking system, which didn't work because pretty much the whole world sees Wall Street as a giant den of vipers and thieves, to paraphrase Andrew Jackson. And not being incentivized to learn from past mistakes, they're back to trying to promote adjustable rate mortgages to tease people into the real estate market. They're going back to the same mistakes that led to the crash of 2008. Why? Well, because they don't have any choice. The entire economy is based on the perceived value of homes in this country, and they can't let those home prices go down. They've been keeping homes off the market, trying to create artificial shortages. They're trying to basically get people to take on new mortgages and keep those housing prices up, because if housing prices were to correct, Wall Street would collapse. And remember, bankers can't stand the idea of a home that you could pay off in 5 to 10 years like you do your car. Because once you've paid off the loan, you are of no more use to those bankers. You might as well just wander off and die. Get out of the way. Bankers that make money off those mortgages and governments that collect money on property taxes want those housing prices to be so high you will spend your entire life working to pay that loan off. And if you take your mortgage payments and calculate them out, you will discover that the bankers get more of your work product than the people who actually built that house and the cost of the materials. And all the bankers do to get that lion's share of your labor and work product was license you to use their ink and paper. That's it. That's the scam. By the time you are done paying off that 30-year mortgage, you will pay the bankers more money than you paid to the original owner of the house. Talking about getting a piece of the action. Now, normally in retail, somebody gets a product into their store and they let out the door for maybe a 20-25% retail margin. Have you ever heard of a retail margin over 100%? That's what they're doing with the housing market. We're going to grab a phone call here. Brett in Michigan. Aloha, Brett. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I have an idea. You know, the last caller, his idea is a good idea, but I think it's like step 2, maybe step 3. Step 1 is we've got to end the supply chain to the enemy. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, we cut the taxes off to them if there's any way to do it. Your idea of allowing that to just collapse would do that, but if there's a way to do it beforehand, it would be great. And give control maybe back to the states, or even go even local and give our federal tax dollars back to the states.
Well, we really ought to, because one of the scams the federal government has been playing for a number of years now is they'll take all this money from the American taxpayer and they give less and less back to the states. In fact, they've even gone as far as, you know, literally compelling the states to engage in certain programs without funding them, the unfunded mandates. And what this does is it forces states to borrow to cover their shortfall. And it's just a very clever, covert way of transferring federal government debt onto the states. So when we talk about the U.S. federal government debt being somewhere around $16 trillion, that's not including another $40 to $50 trillion that has been transferred onto the backs of the states, which is why all these states are in trouble.
I agree. I mean, I just formulating the plan of how to implement that would be the hard part.
Well, that's going to have to be up to ordinary individual citizens, you know, go up and live in the Alaskan bush and, you know, live off the land and not pay taxes there. But we're at the point right now where everybody has to start seriously thinking about delinking from the grid, of breaking this cycle of dependency, of not being forced to be dependent on Monsanto for your food, not being forced to be dependent on the Federal Reserve for your currency, not being forced to be dependent on any of these large corporations for things that you need. You have to start going back to self-sufficiency, of independence, and that means growing your own food in the back of the garden, back of your home, making the things you need for yourself and not going down to the shopping mall. We need to start breaking free now, because when the system comes crashing down, those who are still totally dependent on that system are going to be the worst harmed. And I know the corporate media has been trying to sort of poke fun at preppers, and yes, some of them have gone a little bit overboard, but you should be prepared to basically operate without a federal, state, or local government for an interval of time while the pieces get picked up and we implement the blueprint for the new America.
I agree. I dug a 12,000 square foot garden this year, and I'm trying to get my family ready to be able to live through this, but it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, it is going to be very difficult. It's going to be a very rough time. And again, go back to look at what happened in Russia with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it was only about 2 or 3 months of difficulty before the new Russian republics formed and life got a lot better for the ordinary Russian people. And ever since Putin took control of their central bank, it's getting better still.
I hope we can come up with something.
Well, again, my best advice right now is we know this system is edging toward collapse. Just stay patient. Don't do anything to give the government an excuse to declare a national emergency and martial law. Do not initiate violence against the government. Be prepared to protect yourself and your family if the government initiates violence against you. And just stay patient. It's going to come crashing down the way the Soviet Union did. And that's our best outcome at this point, because we're literally in a race between the collapse of the U.S. economy and the escalation of World War III into a full-on nuclear conflict to force Bretton Woods on the rest of the planet. And this government cannot win this war, ultimately. That's why it's so foolish for them to be persisting. They're already losing control over the lands they've already regime changed and conquered, and still they persist.
I know, and that's why I'd like to try to cut the purse string sooner so we can get away from the wars, because that's where all the money's going. It's not going where it needs to go.
Well, I absolutely agree, and we keep telling people the best thing you can do is you should have no more money in the bank than you need to cover your outstanding checks, and keep the rest under your own control at home. Put some of it into physical gold and physical silver, because that haircut, that scalping they had in Cyprus is now being implemented as policy all across the European Union. It's in the plan for next year's budget for Canada. They're talking about it here. Cyprus, it's now up to 47% of all savings accounts over 100,000 euros. They're literally taking half the money from all of their own customers to try and balance their books and prop up this failed system. We got to take a break for commercials. We will be America, right. Welcome back to the show. We're looking at the latest updates for Tropical Storm Flossie. And again, the new updated storm track shows that it's going to pass directly over us sometime tomorrow afternoon, and we'll be batting down. And, you know, I'm worried about my neighbor. He's building this large wooden boat full of animals. Maybe I should go talk to him about that. We're going to go back to the phones here. Fred in California. Aloha, Fred. Welcome back to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Michael. Thanks for taking my call, and thank you for what you do. Paid member. And for those of you out there listening, please donate to this RBN. Michael, what I wanted to ask you was, have you done any research on these businesses that offer off-site files from your computer? For instance, let's say Carbonite. Are they immune to this surveillance?
Of course not. Of course not. And some of these off-site backup facilities, which are useful if you've got information that you're not worried about people looking at, but the way they're able to pencil this out is they will look for things that are duplicates. For example, if 5,000 people have the exact same MP3 on their computer, they're not going to store it 5,000 times. They'll store one and put pointers to it from the other accounts, so they can reduce their the amount of disk space they're using and lower their costs. But that means they are able to, in fact, deduce what the content of these files actually is. At this point, presume the worst. The NSA has backdoored everything, and unless you're writing your own encryption systems, like I've already demonstrated, assume that it's all wide open. Now, the other problem with these off-site storage facilities is your data is not under your control. Carbonite's already had one bad problem where their system broke down and wiped out a bunch of stuff. There have been a couple of mistakes with cloud servers where people's only copy of the data was on the remote server and it got wiped out. And you don't see a lot of coverage about that. But the rush is on to try and return the world to the model of computing that existed in the 1970s, where all the data and all the software were on these giant mainframe computers that were owned and operated by businesses and the government, and ordinary citizens just had a data terminal. That's the new model. That's why you've got the Los Angeles Unified School District handing out iPads to their students. Don't want them thinking about actually having their own computer that may even have a compiler in it or something like that. The new model is you have a little remote terminal that they will sell you things over, movies, videos, MP3, and you can get your email and web browsing through that, but they're not really useful for doing anything more than that. I remember back in the 1990s, the U.S. government seriously suggested licensing compilers so that people would not be able to write their own computer code without a government-approved license. Now, it went nowhere because of the unenforceability of it. There are compilers all over the place. Many of them are free. most Linux distributions come with a built-in C++ compiler. And so this is clearly a case of the cat out of the bag. But it was seriously proposed that only people licensed by the government be allowed to have compilers.
You know, I called up Carbonite a couple of months ago and asked them about their security system. And what I found very ironic, and it probably with these other security firms as well, is they could not delineate or describe to me how secure of a system they had. That's one. And two, my first thought about businesses like Carbonite is, why put all your information in one basket? You know, I mean, you don't even know where their employees are, who or what, where they came from, who's working at the facility. Can they be hacked into from within? You know what I'm saying?
Oh, well, I think it's a given that they can be the data can be accessed from within. But again, if you have data that is not sensitive and critical, like your old family album or stuff like that, yeah, go ahead and use Carbonite because it gives you an off-site backup. But if you have naughty pictures of your significant other, or you have creative material that you are developing, or a new business venture that you're working on, you need to keep that data under your own personal control and off the net. Because if it's connected to the net, it's wide open to all these backdoors the NSA's been building into the system.
Okay, well, thank you for taking my call, and thank you for what you're doing. And RBN has really improved since John Satmiller redid it a couple of weeks ago. You've got a great venue lineup. So thanks for what you do. I appreciate it.
All right, well, thank you very much. And yeah, RBN is in a period of growth. We're up on the XDS satellite system. So if you want to listen to our offerings on your local AM or FM talk radio station, we need you, the Rivero's Rangers, to go out there and call your local AM and FM talk radio stations and say, there's a source of programming you need to be paying attention to, and kindly direct them to republicbroadcasting.org. And we'll get them all set up. They don't have to pay us anything for the affiliate programming. They just have to be able to be equipped with the XDS system to download it and play it. Probably over at Cumulus they might be considering that right now, because apparently Cumulus Broadcasting has canceled Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity over over their excessively high prices here. So if anybody from Cumulus Broadcasting is listening, we're nowhere near as greedy or demanding as Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity were. So you might want to consider carrying our programming on your network. Certainly we have a lot of people listening to us as trusted.
And good to see you guys grow the way you have been. And thank you again. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. Certainly as public distrust of the corporate offerings on TV and even radio, like on Clear Channel, continue to decline, the time has come for some of these radio networks to say, all right, it's time to go back to a diversity of opinion and bring in some of these competing, opposing points of view, because we're going to get the audience. We're building audience faster here at RBN than Rush Limbaugh is losing his, obviously, at this point. Now, getting back to the economy, this was a very alarming story. This came out of Minnesota Public Radio, and it's talking about a professional musician in the Twin Cities area that goes by the name Venus DeMars. Stage performer, got a bunch of albums out, and lives solely on her music work to the tune of about $20,000 a year is her income. And she considers herself a professional artist. Now, apparently, the Minnesota Department of Revenue came in and issued an arbitrary ruling saying that, well, we don't think you work hard enough to be considered a professional artist and a musician. We think it's just a hobby. And therefore, all your deductible expenses for your supplies and equipment over the last several years are no longer deductible, and you owe us thousands and thousands of dollars in back taxes. Now remember, this Venus DeMars does not have any other employment. So by any reasonable definition of the word, Venus DeMars makes her living off of her music and art endeavors. And the Minnesota Department of Revenue is saying, oh, it's just a hobby that you're making money on, and therefore you're not justified in claiming a business expense deduction. And we know that the states and the cities and the government are just desperate to grab more money, but what a very dangerous idea this is. This is the first step along the way to the government deciding what your job is. We don't care if you've been working as a full-time musician and artist for the last several years. That's not your job. That's your hobby. And this reckless decision will not be applied to merely artists and musicians. It could be applied to people working in their home trying to develop a new invention, a new product. Oh, you can't deduct the expenses on that. It's just a hobby. And that is just going to absolutely kill innovation and development of new products by ordinary Americans. And if you look back at the history of American innovation, some of our greatest inventions came out of people's garages, not the big giant corporations, but garages. I'm thinking about these two bicycle mechanics in Ohio who invented powered flight. And we've reached a point where the thirst for money by corporations and government has simply overridden all other considerations about what is best for this nation. And the idea that the government can say, oh, what you've been doing full-time for the last several years isn't really a job in our view, it's merely a hobby, and therefore we're reversing your deductions for the supplies you used. Even though you're living entirely off of that hobby, it's still just a hobby. It's a very arbitrary ruling. I hope she takes them to court on this one. Now, last week we were talking about this wag the Nazis that we were seeing all over the media, and again, this last weekend I was watching on the local cable TV, and it was all these World War II and Hitler and Nazi movies that they do every time Israel's getting ready to start a war. Well, one of them backflashed on them, and when we come back, I'll tell you what it was. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And as we pointed out many times in the past, there's kind of a historical pattern that anytime Israel is getting ready to launch a war against somebody, inevitably we will see the American corporate media flooded with wag the Nazis. All the cable channels will rerun all the movies about World War II and Hitler and the Nazis. We'll get to see Inglourious Bastards nonstop. They'll be stripping that all over the place. You know, and just all of these stories about, well, like King David's palace being discovered, to just resell us that Israel is always right and everybody else is always wrong. And they'll just use any excuse to get that out there. And so not too long ago, owners of one of the original copies of Schindler's List put it up for sale on eBay. This is one of the typewritten copies that were being used in this program to try and get people out of Nazi Germany. And apparently they got 0 bids. So people just aren't buying into this stuff any longer. We're tired of hearing it. This is all stuff that happened in the first half of the previous century before we were even born. I'm going to be 61 years old, actually a month from today. And all of this stuff about Hitler and the Nazis and whatever it was that was supposed to have happened in Germany happened before I was born. And I'm tired of hearing about it. We have crimes against humanity taking place today. We have a new world war taking place today. And we have to pay attention to those things that we can change here and now. Can't do a thing about what happened in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. And I refuse to accept responsibility for it. But I will accept responsibility for taking steps against the abuses and crimes I'm seeing today against American people. Now, I want to go on to a little bit of a lighter topic for a while, sort of take some of the down and awe off the show here. Apparently, there's been another problem with one of these so-called reality TV shows. And everybody keeps predicting the reality TV craze is over and done, it's going to go away. And no, it won't, because these programs are incredibly inexpensive to produce. And that's why there's always going to be a new reality TV show that they're going to throw up there to try and hold your attention in time for the commercials. I think one of the worst I've seen recently is called, I think it's called Naked and Afraid, where they take this guy and a girl completely naked. They blur the naughty bits, because Even though we are dropping white-hot flaming death on innocent people around the world, we're not allowed to look at the naughty bits on human bodies to prove we're a just and moral people. And they take these people, this couple, and they put them into this wilderness area and say, survive like a caveman. And they follow them around. I've seen the ads for it. I really am not strongly inclined to tune into the show unless they de-blur the naughty bits. But apparently, over at HGTV, they've had a show called House Hunters. You know, House and Garden TV. And apparently, it's not as real as you're being told. It's all staged to have a happy outcome. And I don't know if you were a follower of Storage Wars. I did watch that one for a while. And there was this one character, Dave Hester, who was rather annoying and obnoxious. And apparently he was canned from the show. And he has now sued Storage Wars. And he's gone public saying it isn't a real show. That the producers of the show put antiques and artifacts and treasures in the storage rooms to be found. He says in some cases they've completely faked entire storage lockers to build the show. I'm shocked they were faking it. Apparently the show's producers paid for a breast enhancement for one of the ongoing female characters to increase her sex appeal. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not surprised that reality shows aren't real. They were always strangely concocted, like, you know, put these people on an island and have them figure out a way to get off. That's not something we encountered in real life. It was a concocted, contrived context to begin with. See, what are some of the others are out there? The one where they have people in the dark and drop hamsters all over them to hear them scream. It's another one. Don't fail to miss this one. Apparently, over in Nashville, Tennessee, they're piloting a new reality TV show, and the sole concept of it is they found this man who has fathered 22 children by 14 different women, and they're going to do a reality show of how he sort of, goes around from kid to kid and woman to woman trying to keep domestic felicity going on. I don't plan on watching that one either. I thought about piloting a reality show about what I do called Blogger, but the pilot was just 30 minutes of me typing on a computer and swearing profanities, and so I don't think anybody's going to pick that one up here. Now, on a more serious note, out here in Hawaii, we have seen recently a flood of TV commercials promoting the idea that people should have freedom to choose when they die, and selling the idea that there are all these very wonderful modern medications your doctor can give you to just sort of put you to sleep so that you don't wake up again. And I find these ads very offensive because they're not really pushing right to choose. Okay, if I have a right to choose when I'm going to die, my choice is never. And it turns out what's going on, the backstory is under current Hawaii law, assisted suicide is a felony. Whether it's a doctor or your neighbor, they can face manslaughter charges. And there's a group in here that is lobbying to change the law to allow physician-assisted suicide. Okay? And it is clear from this that the new fascist economic model is to work Americans until they drop and keep them alive only so long as they are useful to the corporations. And then when they become no longer useful, and it's just not worth keeping them alive any longer, we're just going to get rid of them. Save a few bucks on the tail end there. This idea of a retirement, oh, what a silly idea that is. We can't have retiring people. Look at how all those retiring baby boomers messed up Social Security. And by the way, the baby boomers did not mess up Social Security. The government increased Social Security taxes to cover the baby boomer retirements. The Clinton administration spent that money, and now they can't pay it back. But they won't admit the government screwed it up. Oh, it's the fault of all those retirees. Really, if they're loyal Americans, they should drop dead on the job. Going to grab a phone call here. George in Texas. Aloha, George. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
How you doing, Mike? Sitting there, I've written on, Mike, thank you for posting about the entertainment industry. And I notice there's no creativity anymore, because when I watch the Sci-Fi Network with this movie called Sharknado, which scientifically impossible can never happen, you know, because the sharks would die in a tornado before they ever tried eating anybody. It just shows there's no creativity anymore. It's all cheesy, or it's just
Well, I can tell you why that happened. all the really creative, brilliant people in Hollywood have been driven out by the FBI. I know there was this very qualified visual effects supervisor who was doing very well in Hollywood who got driven out. And I'm joking, of course, here, but it is very, very serious. I mean, when you start pushing this political correctness on the entertainment industry, the really creative thinking people get sick and tired of it all, and they just leave. And we get into this cycle of constant regurgitating the old stories. They've come out with another Superman movie. How many times do we have to see that? Endless reruns of stuff. I mean, there's back to stripping Harry Potter again, and I love the Harry Potter movies the first 20 times I saw them, but I'm getting sick and tired of them. But you're absolutely right. Hollywood is completely taken over by politically correct lackeys who will toe the government's propaganda line, and original, out-of-the-box thinking is very much discouraged. We saw this even back during the McCarthy hearings and the blacklisting in Hollywood, where the best minds, because they were thinkers and were asking questions, they were simply driven out of the industry. And the quality of Hollywood's film and TV offerings suffered accordingly. And, that's where it is. The really bright, creative people have been basically blacklisted out of the town. Got to take a break for news and station identification. We'll be right back. America, welcome to our show, hour number 3. Dan, the man, is now in the control room, taking control of the Truth Warp Drive. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Want to go back here for a couple of minutes to Wiener's Wiener and the ongoing scandal over his sexting images of his private parts to female associates who apparently went along with this for months on end. Now they're trying to come back and say, oh, he pressured us, he abused us. What you do is you don't hit that reply button the first time it happens, and then the abuser goes away. But they were sending pictures back, and it was kind of a mutually cooperative thing. And I don't agree with it because Wiener was married. But apparently back in 2011, when it first surfaced as a scandal, Wiener tried to claim that somebody hacked into his personal private pictures and then leaked them onto Twitter. Well, I have a hard time believing that anybody would take pictures of their own private parts just for their own personal consumption and keep them on their little hard drive. Seems a little silly. And as it turned out, the hacking story was a complete lie, but apparently the Wiener campaign spent $45,000 on a private investigator to try and build the case that somebody had hacked the pictures and released them. So they were out there just trying to, create a case for a crime that never happened. We're going to grab a phone call here. Michael in Ohio. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? Aloha.
Okay.
Hello?
Yes. Can you turn down your speaker here? You're on the air.
Okay, I've turned it down. You shouldn't be getting any feedback now, are you?
We're fine now. What's on your mind?
Okay. Hey, I've been, I don't know what you call an avid reader of your website the past few years since I got exposed to it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm medically retired, don't have a lot of money, so I haven't joined your webcast or anything, but I get on here, and most of the time when I peruse your site and click on the stories and stuff like that, I have my music playing in the background, just background music just to listen to. And recently, you're probably aware, we get a lot more pop-ups show up. I got rid of them, but today I clicked on there, and immediately when I was listening to music in the background, it started playing the radio show live, and I finally figured out just by clicking onto it, I could stop it being live. But then when I go to a story and come back, it starts up live again. So
I know. I've had a lot of people complain about that. We switched from Justin TV, which was getting very abusive with their mid-roll ads, and we're now using BAM User, but I'm aware that the player starts automatically when it comes back to the page, and I'm in communication with them right now to make it so that the default is not to play until somebody clicks the play button, but we are aware of that, and we're trying to deal with it. We're going to a new provider. I understand there aren't anywhere near as many ads. The image quality is a lot better, and so overall it's been a good move for us, and I'm canceling my Justin TV account. But there are some wrinkles that we do need to work out, and I'm aware of that one already. Okay?
Yes, and as an aside, I'd like to tell you I do appreciate your site. Now that it is live, there are possibly times I will click on it and even listen to you live, and I have no problem with that. And if I had the money to send you at times to, get you back up and running, I would be more than happy to do it. But like a lot of other people in the mainland, I guess you refer to us, I don't have a lot of money all the time, so...
No, I understand, and it's actually very hard for me to ask for donations for that reason, because I understand the vast majority of our listening audience and our readership are people who are in dire financial circumstances because of what's going on, and that's why I don't do regular fundraising banners on my I don't do a campaign every quarter or something saying we have to hit a goal of $20,000-$30,000, because I understand most people reading the site and listening to the show, they just don't have it, and I don't want them to feel bad because they don't have it, because I understand it's not their failing, it is the failing of this government that has just absolutely crushed down the American people into the very dirt to prop up this failed Ponzi scheme banking system, and I don't want anybody to ever feel bad if they're not donating, because believe me, I understand what you're going through.
Well, also as an aside, I am retired from computers and electronics, and I am very, very able in troubleshooting and repairing computers and stuff over the phone. And if you would get in touch with me personally anytime you had a computer problem, I would be more than happy to try to solve it over the phone for you, and possibly could. And I would, if I could contribute in that way in any way, I'd be more than happy to.
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you drop me an email with your contact information, and I'll put you in the file of people I scream at every time I get into trouble here. But please don't mention your contact information over the air, or you're going to get a whole bunch of people harassing you. Oh, you're calling into that Jew-hating network. All right, so, Michael, thank you very much for the kind offer. We're going to let you go here. And moving right along. Now, we have been talking over the last couple of weeks about the revelation that virtually every modern electronic system seems to have a backdoor in it for nefarious purposes. We understand that this security expert had found out it was possible to remotely access and interfere with implanted pacemakers. He was going to present this week at the Black Hat Conference in Las Vegas, which is basically a get-together of NSA's lackeys out there in the computer security world. And he died under mysterious circumstances. The only details we've got is he was found dead in his hotel room. It may take months to find out what he died of, which is their way of saying we're never going to tell you. Same thing with Yasser Arafat. We're already months past the end of when they said they would have the test results if he was poisoned with polonium-210. Silence. Silence is deafening. It's been confirmed now by many researchers that modern computerized cars can be hacked into over the Bluetooth, the Wi-Fi, the cellular phone system, and the car's controls taken over by remote command. There have been some videos out there showing how that's done. And now we're finding out that the car key immobilizer system, can be bypassed. This is a product that is put out by Volkswagen and the French defense group Thales. Basically, hackers came out and said it is possible to bypass this, so you can get into a car even though the immobilization system is supposed to be there to prevent the locks from being picked or jimmied. And the British courts have blocked the revelation of the hack because they want you to have a false sense of security and go on buying those Volkswagens. But the fact is, now that it's known to be possible, it's only a matter of time before the car criminals will work out for themselves how to do it. This ruling is all about reassuring you everything is okay, and that if you buy a car with this system in it, your car will be safe from being stolen, and it isn't. Remember, Great Britain, when they passed their gun ban, crime went up. And Great Britain kept the gun ban with the explanation that the British subjects felt safer, even though they really weren't. So it's all about image. It's all about shadow. It's all about public relations. So you're not really safer with Britain's gun ban, and your car really isn't more secure with this immobilizer system. They just want you to think that it is. The disconnect between reality and the image the government puts out to you is just getting wider and wider and wider. And it's hardly confined to Great Britain. We see the same thing here. All righty, let's see. We're coming up on another break here. Apparently, Monsanto has been teaming up with the U.S. military to target GMO activists. They're out there still trying to ensure the world believes their GMO products are safe. They actually took out a 3-quarter-page ad here in the local Hawaii newspaper to say, oh, GMOs are safe. There's no evidence of any harm whatsoever because, especially since that French study with the rats, a lot of people here on the island of Oahu are very concerned about all these test GMO fields all over this island and all over all the other islands. Monsanto does a lot of testing out here, and the wind blows. More about that when we come back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And speaking of Monsanto and GMO, Monsanto's latest public relations maneuver is to basically put it out that Monsanto's GMO pollen doesn't spread. And they're trying to basically head off this growing deluge of lawsuits from America's wheat farmers who are discovering that their wheat crop has become contaminated with Monsanto's test unapproved GMO wheat. Like that field up in Oregon that was discovered to be contaminated. And this particular wheat is not approved for public use. Foreign purchasers of American wheat are canceling orders like crazy. And Monsanto's defense now is our pollen doesn't spread. And there's absolutely no foundation for that statement. It's just that is their policy. They're going to go into court and say, you have to prove our pollen went from point A to point B. That's ridiculous. The burden of proof should be on Monsanto. Look, it's your designer genes. It's your product. Monsanto actually floated a couple of weeks ago that some nefarious conspiracy activists stole the GMO pollen from their test fields and carried it all the way to Oregon and spread it on that field, hoping to embarrass Monsanto. That's nonsense. Birds carry pollen. Bees carry pollen. Tropical storm Flossie that's bearing down on us right now is going to take every bit of pollen all over this island and spread it everywhere else. It's ludicrous for Monsanto to be making a claim like that. It's like the old days of the Soviet Union where they'd simply say, there are no people starving here. And you were expected to believe that because that's what the government said. Apparently down in Brazil, there's an agronomist down there, Leonardo Malgarajo, who represents the Ministry of Agrarian Development in Brazil, saying that GMO has damaged Brazilian agriculture, made it worse than it was before. Now we're seeing more and more people asking, is GMO really necessary or essential to ending world starvation? And the answer is no, because the GMO varieties of crops are producing lower yields than their natural counterparts. The GMO versions of crops are proving to be far less resistant to drought conditions than the natural counterparts. So for all the cost and expense of putting the GMO into your fields, and now, of course, the weeds are evolving to be tolerant to glyphosate, so you're back to having the expensive GMO seeds bought on credit, plus you're still having to pour all the pesticides all over the grounds to keep the weeds down. It's all downside, no upside, and you're getting less saleable crop from it. So why are they still pushing this? Well, it's because if Monsanto's GMO pollen succeeds in contaminating all the natural varieties, then Monsanto will now have complete control over food production on planet Earth. There will be no more natural or organic anything. And anybody on planet Earth who is eating any vegetables ultimately is sending money to Monsanto. They're trying to privatize and monopolize food production. That's the goal here. Because the stated goals of glyphosate resistance and you don't have to spread the weed killers on your plants anymore, that didn't work out. The idea that GMOs producing more abundant food is provably nonsense. But it's about taking corporate control of food production, taking it away from nature and putting it in some giant factory with which to make money, to force us to be dependent on Monsanto for our daily bread. And not just our bread. Apparently, Monsanto is now proposing GMO oranges to solve some imaginary problem here. All righty, we got a couple of callers on the line. Jim in Alabama. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. How are you today?
Fine.
Great. Listen, you talking about Monsanto saying that their pollen doesn't spread. That is the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard in my life.
That was my reaction when I read it.
Because the basis of many of their lawsuits is that you have grower A growing GMO corn, and 2 miles down the road you have grower B trying to grow organic corn, and there's cross-pollination. And they're suing the organic grower because he has Monsanto genetics on his property, even though he didn't plant the corn.
And the alarming part is they're winning these lawsuits, and they're taking these small farms away from these people who are innocent. Yeah, you know, we ought to be treating GMO contamination as a toxic waste accident, you know, and force Monsanto to have a super fund to clean the genes out of areas they're not supposed to be. Of course, we realize how incredibly difficult that is. In order to get rid of contaminated pollen on your farmland, you have to let it lie fallow for 3 whole years to guarantee that the pollen has died off.
Yep. Well, this is just fascism in action.
Yes.
You know, and so that's all I've got to say, buddy. Love the show. Listen every day. Take care. Talk to you again soon.
All right. Thank you very much for the call, Jim. We're going to switch over to Werner in New Brunswick. Aloha, Werner. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Good afternoon, Mike. You mentioned there about GMO, and the last caller, he elaborated some of it. But when I first heard about those ridiculous lawsuits where the farmers got convicted, and one that stands out especially is Percy Schmeiser, the traditional seed grower and plant breeder there in Saskatchewan, when the Supreme Court of Canada decided against him. And I asked the question, those judges that are involved in making the decision in those lawsuits, they have to disclose their financial holdings in their pension funds and in their private investment portfolios.
Yeah, they should. They absolutely should. I mean, you know, clear conflict of interest here. I mean, all judges should have all their financial holdings on public display, you know, in order to guarantee that we're not getting judicial decisions that are being, you know, motivated by private investment. In fact, when we talk about the blueprint for the new America, all judges, all appointed officials, all elected officials, everybody ought to have their wealth in a blind trust during their time of office, not just the president, but all of them. Because, you know, going back to Congress in 2008 with TARP, they're making decisions based on their own wallets and their own investment portfolios. I think there was one case where it actually did come out that a judge that was ruling in one of these GMO cases was heavily invested in the GMO company. And, you know, it's got to stop because this GMO technology is the most dangerous technology ever played with, and it's being recklessly deployed and implemented without proper controls. You know, you've got this pollen is blowing all over the place, and the real danger is not just the altered genes themselves, but as the crop grows, the altered genes are producing somewhat different proteins. The real problem is protein expression, because when you cook the GMO food, yes, the DNA will break up. But if you've got malformed proteins, they can provoke immune response problems, allergies. And again, we have all these peer-reviewed studies, like the study with the rats in France, showing that rats that are fed a diet of the GMO corn develop these hideous tumors. This is very dangerous. And we've reached a state where the fact that Monsanto is insanely profitable seems to be overriding all of the considerations that we may be poisoning, you know, our future workforce and taxpayers.
Well, as I say, the criminality reaches into the highest places. And then it comes with the politicians when they vote on some of those issues. It's the same situation as with the judges.
All right. Well, listen, I got to let you go here. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be back after these words from our sponsor. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And getting back to the subject of donations, when donations come in, I always like to send out a little email of thank you. Unfortunately, somebody just sent in a very generous donation. And when I tried to send the thank you, the email bounced. So if you're still listening to the show, thank you very much for your support of our work, and I was not able to directly reply to you because the email address you put in PayPal doesn't go anywhere, but thank you, and you know who you are. I'm looking on the corporate media right now, and President Obama is coming out and whining about the lack of success to convince America that they want Obamacare. They've lined up all these celebrities about, oh, yes, this is the way to go, like Hollywood film and TV celebrities really know anything about medical care or the economy, with few exceptions, Charlie Sheen being one of them. And the Obama administration is screaming that the reason Obamacare is failing is because the critics of the law are outspending the White House by 4-1, which is basically Obama does not want to admit that the American people are rejecting his policy. He's going to blame it on, oh, the healthcare opponents, they're outspending us. It's a vast right-wing conspiracy. He's recycling the Clinton administration dodges. We, the people of the United States, do not want Obamacare. We're sick and tired of government intruding into our lives and our health and our privacy. Enough is enough is enough. The promises that this was going to reduce health care costs have not materialized. Now we've got Nancy Pelosi out there saying, nobody here said it was going to drive prices down. We've already seen health insurance prices going right through the roof, quality of care and service going down. It's another government giveaway to the insurance and the medical industrial complex. It's got nothing to do with what opponents of Obamacare are spending. It's the American people realizing it for another government scam. And Obama doesn't want to admit failure. Oh, there's phony scandals. We have to focus on Obamacare, and you would all love it if it wasn't for those evil right-wing conspiracy just pointing out its obvious and multiple flaws. Speaking of obvious and multiple flaws, there is continuing a major scandal involving wind farms. Now, wind power is actually a good idea if it's implemented correctly. And we were talking about a growing problem here in the United States of America where wind farms that were built at huge taxpayer subsidies were getting into trouble and not able to pencil out, not able to turn a profit, because one of the most commonly used wind turbines is not living up to its predicted 20-year lifespan. They are failing in as early as 3 years. And apparently some of the parts are no longer available. And so people are having to say, well, we can't find the part for this one. We have a new, improved wind turbine to sell you at a huge cost. And sometimes I wonder if these solar projects and wind projects are intentionally set up to fail in order to keep us dependent on the oil and coal companies for our energy, or nuclear. Yes, solar power would be really good, but yeah, we just can't make it work. Wind power would be great, but we can't get that to work. I'm sure they could be gotten to work properly if somebody wanted that to actually happen. But we have seen time and time again where research into alternatives, anything, are actually set up to fail. To use as the counterexample that, yes, alternative energy would be really great, but we can't make it happen now, so let's go conquer another Middle East oil nation and suck the oil out from underneath them. Which brings us on to global warming. Last week, there was a plethora of stories over the fact that a weather buoy in the Arctic Ocean appeared to be floating in free open water, about 350 kilometers from the pole. And it was all over the place. Proves the ice cap is melting. The ice cap is melting. The polar bears are drowning. And apparently, as of today, the buoy is reporting that it is stuck in solid ice again. It was a fluke. And it gets back to a question that remains unanswered by all the carbon Nazis. How many active volcanoes are there on the floors of the world's oceans? And don't be embarrassed if you don't know the answer. It's a trick question. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how many active volcanoes and thermal vents there are on the floors of the world's ocean. Maybe this buoy on its ice drifted over the plume from one of these underwater eruptions, and it temporarily melted the water, and then it drifted out and it refroze again. Seems like a likely explanation for the observed facts. And because of all that unknown number of active volcanoes and thermal vents on the floor of the world's ocean, anybody who says that human activity has warmed the Earth's ocean by thus and such is just smoking opium, because they can't know. In order to determine human contributions to ocean warming, you have to be able to subtract out all other causes of warming. And if you don't know how many volcanoes are down there, then that's impossible to do. It was only a few years ago they discovered that the El Nino current in the South Pacific had nothing to do with human activity and weather. There's a chain of previously unknown undersea volcanoes down there. And when they get really erupting, that's what produces the El Nino current. As a matter of fact, the western Arctic Sea ice coverage is the highest it has been since 2002. Another reminder that all of these dire warnings from 10 years ago about how the world was warming and snow would be a thing of the past, they didn't come out. And they're still trying to figure out some way they can sell you on the carbon tax because they're desperate for more money. Now, a very interesting story. This was over at the Daily Mail in Great Britain. Apparently, observations from the European Space Agency and NASA Solar and Heliospheric Observatory spotted between the 13th and 18th of July a very strange, gigantic hole in the sun's corona, the sun's atmosphere. Now, if you were just looking up at the sky, you wouldn't notice anything different. But this hole in the corona covered a quarter of the sun's surface. They've never seen anything like it before. And of course, with that hole in the corona, the sun was spewing out solar wind and all kinds of material out into the solar system. And they've never seen anything like it before. And it is a reminder. Astronomers do not fully understand the sun. Accurate scientific observations of the sun have only been possible for the last 100 years. They know about the 11-year sunspot cycle. They know about the 22-year magnetic cycle. We don't know if there are longer cycles. Russian scientists are now saying there seem to be indications of that may be related to the Maunder minimum that brought the little ice age, and we could be headed into another one now because this gigantic blank spot in the corona was completely unexpected. None of the solar theories explain it. And remember, it is that sun that is the overwhelming dominant control factor in Earth's climate. Not those little plastic bags you're using, not that SUV that you're driving, not setting your thermostat an extra degree high or an extra degree low. The sun controls climate on Earth, and secondary to that is the shape of the Earth's orbit itself. And until these carbonazis, until the worshippers at the altar of St. Al of the Gore can control solar output or shift the shape of the Earth's orbit, there's not a thing they can do to stop climate change. It's just another scam to take your money and trick you out of your obedience. Meanwhile, NOAA has had to cancel their participation in the next European Space Agency weather satellite program. Apparently, the U.S., in partnership with Europe, was going to furnish 3 observation instruments for Europe's next-generation polar orbiting weather satellite system. And because of sequestration, because, golly gee, we had to give the money to Wall Street, we had to buy bombs for the war, had to buy bombs for the Syrian rebels, hired mercenaries, had to give money to Israel, so we had to cancel taking part in this new European weather satellite system. And apparently it is enough of a significant loss where the European Space Agency is going to have to stop, pull back, and redesign the satellite and find other sources for this particular instrument platform. So for all the screaming about global warming and environment and all the rest of it, when the metal meets the satellite, they weren't there. We're not going to take part in this thing. We don't need to observe the real weather. We've got our computer models that tell us the world is getting warming, and it's all the fault of the human beings. We don't need to look at the real world. We're scientists. Anyway, continuing controversy over fracking, and we're now starting to see the oil and gas industry mounting their own public relations campaign, claiming that they have got all kinds of scientists who are willing to say that fracking is completely safe and there is no such thing as methane in the drinking water. We'll be America, right, welcome back to the show here. We were talking about fracking, and by now I'm sure you've seen the documentary Gasland and Gasland Part 2. It is a major problem. They're drilling down into these shale oil fields. They're fracking them with highly toxic chemicals and then insisting there's no way that any of this stuff could ever get into the drinking water. And there are people all across the country, because this is a nationwide scandal, saying that all of a sudden they're getting methane bubbles in their drinking water. They're getting other chemicals, toxic chemicals in their drinking water. And the oil and gas company's attitude is, oh, absolutely not. We have all these well-paid scientists who say that it's perfectly safe and it could never, ever, ever contaminate the water, which is what Pacific Gas and Electric was saying about that hexavalent chromium that they were dumping into those pools out there in California here. Meanwhile, we have studies like this one down at the University of Texas at Arlington that did a water quality survey and found unequivocally well water contaminants are highest near these natural gas drilling locations. So it's a huge, major health scandal. We're talking about why there don't seem to be as many songbirds around anymore. Well, because birds are very susceptible to methane toxicity. Canary in the coal mine. We see all these weird mass fish die-offs where they'll say, oh, well, there was no oxygen left in the water. Well, how do you get rid of the oxygen in water? You bubble methane through it, which will produce more water molecules and carbon dioxide and deplete the oxygen in the water so the fish die. It's another classic case of money junkies making decisions that have potential health and safety ramifications for all of us. Now, the corporate media here is apparently responding to mass criticism from the independent media over the strange and sudden way they stopped talking about certain aspects of Floodgate. We were mentioning that even earlier in the show. The focus is all on Benghazi. They're going to pin the Benghazi on the Obama because that's a scandal that doesn't delegitimize the entire government. And they moved away from the IRS targeting of dissidents, the NSA spying on us all, and apparently the public pressure is pushing back the other way. And so now the media is trying to rationalize why they dropped the IRS scandal as being no big deal. And what it shows is public outcry is starting to work. They're having to respond to us. So I have a suggestion for all of you. I know that the sheer number of scandals and problems that we have in this country is very daunting, and it's very, very difficult to keep track of them all. And I think probably we shouldn't try, unless you're manic like me and drink a lot of coffee to get through it all. But I think every one of you ought to pick the one scandal that infuriates you more than any other. And just focus on that as you talk to your friends and family. We're crowdsourcing the scandals. We, the people, are going to take control of the focus of public awareness in this country. It's time to just stop hanging out at blogs and go out there to the human net. Carbon-based life form, talking to carbon-based life form about whichever scandal it is you think that most angers you. Whether it's IRS targeting of political dissidents, a government that ignores the Constitution, whatever it was that happened in Benghazi, constant bowing and scraping of our government to Israel, these endless wars of conquest against nations that did not actually commit any crime against the United States of America, torture, rendition, concentration camps. There's a whole list out there that you can pick one from, but pick one. Pick the one that makes you angry, study up on it, and just start talking to your friends, your coworkers, people you meet at the store about it. We have taken control of the minds of America away from that corporate media. And we can keep in the public mind those scandals the government wishes we would all forget about. Because we're in control now. We, the people, are in control of the flow of information in our society. We took it back, and now we have to use it. So just find that one scandal that really ticks you off. That one scandal, whatever it is. I'm not going to tell you which scandal to pick. Pick your own. Got a huge selection. Just pick it. Study up on it. Have the facts. Global warming fraud. Inciting racism to distract from whatever. Whatever it is you want to do. But pick it and be vocal. And get out there and start talking. And I'll tell you why. Because the more you find the courage to speak out in public about what's gone wrong with this nation, the more you will give courage to those around you to speak out about what they think has gone wrong with this nation. And out of that discussion and dialogue will come the public consensus of what we have to do next. This is your time to get involved. This is your time to put your hand on the tiller of history and give it a little tiny nudge to try and get the ship of state sort of kind of back on course toward being a republic to serve we the people with a democratically elected legislature. And if we can't get it back on track, at least we can shove it onto the rocks and start thinking about building a new one. Because we're past the point where we can work within this system. This system is all about protecting itself, protecting its wealth, protecting its privilege, protecting its religious presumptions, that their imaginary playmate insists they get all the wealth and comfort, that they are somehow deserving of a larger share of life's blessings than anybody else on planet Earth, by hook or by crook. And again, I am not attacking rich people. There are people who became rich through honest effort. George Lucas, I saw an interview with him over the weekend. Good example. Very bright guy. Came up with Star Wars. Yes, we want to watch Star Wars. Here, we're going to buy your movie tickets. We're going to buy the little play figures. We're going to buy a lightsaber. I even have a lightsaber. There you are. And George Lucas got rich off of that, and we don't resent him for that one bit. We admire him, and rightly so. The curse of this nation are the money junkies who are convinced they must become rich and not put anything of value back into society in exchange for it. That is our problem. All righty, let's see. Getting back to some other news things. Apparently this Glaxo scandal over in China is growing. Glaxo was using free trips as bribery to Chinese officials. Apparently they had a stable, if you will, of hired sex workers to provide free sexual favors to people that they wanted to sign contracts. And it's just really growing out of control. And it is a reminder that these large pharmaceutical companies are not becoming prosperous on the basis of selling quality products that do not harm their patients. It's all bribery and corruption. Remember when Bayer Company had this medication for hemophiliacs that was found to be tainted with the AIDS virus, couldn't sell it in the United States of America. Did they do the responsible thing and destroy all the medication? Heck no. They went and sold it in other countries that didn't have legal prohibitions on it. And they just spread HIV all over those foreign countries. But they made money, and now they can sell HIV medications to those patients. My goodness. I've got nothing against making money. But for society as a whole to function, there has to be a balancing of priorities. It's good to make money. It's also good to build quality products. It's also good to take care of the infrastructure. It's also good to have quality education for our young people. We have to balance society. And society right now is very much out of balance in service to the money junkies. What was that Indian word, koyanaskatsi, life out of balance? We're there. We're absolutely there. Had that story a while back. CDC admitted 98 million Americans received a polio vaccine contaminated with a cancer virus. That's okay. We've got the cancer cure centers all over the place. They'll sell you a cure to what we just gave you. And apparently the scandal is growing in that industry-backed researchers into the vaccine knowingly and intentionally hid the links to cancer. They knew there was a problem and kept it quiet because I've got stock options. All right, there's the music. We got to head on out of here, get something useful done with the rest of the day. There's the music back again. So we'll be back tomorrow here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay well, stay skeptical, stay informed. Please support Republic Broadcasting. Thank you for all the help you've done so far. You got us up on XDS Satellite. Now we need you to help go out and convince the affiliates to sign on. Aloha America.